Disney Star Wars' new show is perfect. Not because I think it's genuinely good or praiseworthy. It's not. But it is a perfect representation of what Star Wars has become under Disney, which has led to the show garnering more chaotic, divisive online rancor than much of what's come before it. The Acolyte has become so divisive that self-proclaimed Star Wars fans are bickering like a married couple going through a divorce. And while I think some of the criticism leveled at the Acolyte and Disney Star Wars in general is justified, I also think a lot of it is missing one big point. So while some argue over the levels of wokeness or the lore-breaking, plot-hole-punching, nonsensical writing, I have a different bone to pick. One that I would argue is the root cause of everything else. When it comes to fan criticism, Star Wars has seen more than its fair share. From the changes that have been made to the original trilogy, to the prequels, and the sequel trilogy, there's no shortage of complaint and quarreling about who Star Wars is for, what lore is sacrosanct, and whether Han shot first.
Yes, I bet you have.
So today's ongoing tussle between different parts of the fandom isn't anything new. And that is why, besides taking a couple sidelong shots at the treatment of OG Star Wars characters in the sequel trilogy, I haven't really talked about Star Wars in any depth. Watching them systematically squander all that potential and goodwill that the series had by putting politics and messaging over storytelling killed whatever investment I had in the franchise. But being a jaded former fan might just come with some additional clarity, as any felt need to defend Star Wars has long since evaporated. And with it, I may have the ability to add a viewpoint that I have not really heard discussed so far. To get into this, I will first need to ask a question. What is Star Wars? What is the core of this storied universe, its most defining attribute? I understand that this might be a subjective question, with as many answers as replies. But for my part, one of the most, if not the most defining attribute of Star Wars is the Force itself. The energy life force that seems to have a will and a purpose, running through and generated by all living things in the universe.
Life creates it, makes it grow. Its energy surrounds us and binds us.
It is not a unique concept by any stretch, but it is at the center of much of what Star Wars builds upon, not the least of which is its bifurcation into light and dark sides. The light represents good, the dark evil. It's something so simple and easy that everyone can understand and get behind it, or at least they could for the decades between the 1970s and the 2000s. As we edged closer to the end of the aughts and into the 2010s, outside forces began to exert a growing influence over media and culture. Good and evil, which in the past had been clearly defined with objective standards and principles, were being thrown into doubt and confusion. Having sides that had always been defined by good and evil in absolutist terms were seen as problematic by activist contrarians who sought to muddy the waters. They insist on reading real-world problems into fictional settings, pulling fantasy into reality, or at least what passes for reality in their minds. For an outside example of what I'm talking about, you can see those who have attacked Dungeons & Dragons and other fantasy worlds over races that are depicted as inherently evil, like orcs and goblins, while normal people with average IQs can understand the concept of there being a thoroughly corrupted, entirely fictional race born of evil bent only on carrying out atrocities. Activists see this as wrong, because those fictional fantasy races could be read as allegories for real-life races and be used to dehumanize them, a thought that only occurs to those who pretend to be offended by it. But regardless, in big and little ways, activists in the media have sought to rid fiction of the classic good versus evil trope, instead painting good as not always good, and painting evil as morally complex and misunderstood. This is the approach that the Ravagers at Disney have taken with Star Wars. It is no longer a story of light versus dark, good versus evil.
Star Wars is always about rebels versus institutional threat.
And since they've gutted that central pillar, they have to change the standard bearers for each side. The Jedi are no longer the inherently good guardians of peace, but an institution of dominance and oppression, forcing their selfish sense of morality on the rest of the galaxy. Likewise, the Sith are not inherently evil, but people with complex motivations who have been harmed by the provocations of the Jedi.
Then the Jedi become the antagonists. Not the bad guys, but they become the bad guys to the bad guys.
I mean, the best parts about Star Wars is there is no good or evil. It depends on what side you're standing on, truly. You know what I mean?
Because I feel like Star Wars is very, like, patriarchal, so it was kind of cool to have, like, this sort of woman-centered figure.
This isn't about good or bad. This is about power and who is allowed to use it.
But if you have now reoriented the core of what Star Wars is about from the ongoing conflict between good and evil, then what is Star Wars? All you have left is the aesthetic trappings that have defined the visuals. Lightsabers, robes, and masks. Starships, droids, and Wookiees. A blend of futuristic sci-fi and Akira Kurosawa fantasy. And that is all Star Wars is now. All the superficial trappings of the franchise we used to love, draped around a progressive struggle session, wherein writers and actors get to release their personal metaphysical angst. It is out of this all other problems emanate. The creative and ethical rot that has caused Star Wars to implode on itself like a black hole, which sucked in and destroyed anything good about the franchise. The parts that are left, the things that everyone is currently fighting over now, is just the debris left over swirling around the event horizon, before it too is lost to the gaping chasm of destruction. Sadly, I don't think there's any way to save Star Wars in its current state. Not with the Ravagers who are currently running Disney and Lucasfilm. But maybe if Star Wars was allowed to go into hibernation, left untouched for years, and if the intellectual rights were given to someone who actually understood the franchise and put storytelling above all else. Someone who could recenter it on the conflict between good and evil. Then maybe, in a long time in the future, in a Hollywood far, far away, maybe we could get an enjoyable Star Wars again. But as always, this is all just one rebel's opinion. What do you think? What makes Star Wars special to you? Let me know in the comments. Like the video, and subscribe to the channel so you'll always get the latest updates from Rebel Normal.